Oh, good morning, protege, or of course, good afternoon to my wonderful and favorite afternoon class. Hey, I hope this direct instructional Zoomcast finds you well. So this, of course, is going to be my lecture, and it's going to be for, of course, Wednesday, and it's January 12th, 2022. Let's get into it, shall we? You guys know the drill at this point. So I am going to share my screen with everybody. Again, we are on a new day, new date, new page. So don't go back to the previous notes. New clean sheet of paper. Always start your notes on the right side. You should have already dated your notes for today. It's January 12th, 2022. Blue or black pen only, please. Thank you so much. And again, I'm going to respectfully ask everybody, I know you have your highlighters and your correctable tape on your desk, but I'm going to respectfully ask you again, please refrain from using it as you're watching the Zoomcast, because I want you to be focusing, I want you to be listening, and I want you to be taking really good copious notes in your ISNs, not just the main ideas, but again, we have to be adding additional notes, those oral note-taking. We really need to take it, note-taking to that next level. Some of you are doing a phenomenal job. I want to be able to say all of you are doing a phenomenal job. All right. So on the top line, you're going to write down for me. We're going to watch multiple video clips today in my Zoomcast, and it's called Guy Questions, Hitler's Triumph of the Will Speech, 1934. So again, dovetailing back to my previous direct instructional Zoomcast, what we're trying to do is we're trying to analyze and understand how this failed artist from Braunau, Austria, rose to become not just, again, the Chancellor in 1933, but ultimately dictator of Nazi Germany in 1934, the Führer in German, which means leader. And then basically 5 years after that, in 1939, September 1st, when Hitler again orders the invasion of my ancestral homeland of Poland by Nazi Germany, this basically marks the beginning of World War II. So yes, he single-handedly started the worst recorded war in history. So we're trying to figure out, how did he pull this off? So as I stated in my previous direct instructional Zoomcast, again, it was Hitler's ability to convey a message through oratory. He was a demagogue. A demagogue is a very powerful public speaker, but the catch is they focus and target their audience's negative, dark emotions, which sometimes results in negative, dark actions. And that's certainly, again, a very apt way of describing Hitler, the Nazi Party, and what eventually happens when he, in my opinion, brainwashes Germany and makes it and converts it into Nazi Germany. So here we go, if you would write this down. So as you're watching this Triumph of the Will speech of 1934, we're not going to analyze the content, because again, the content's going to be centering around his themes, things like revenge, things like humiliation, things like anti-Semitism, but rather what we're going to focus on is his delivery. So I want you to describe for me Hitler's entrance into, again, the arena where he's giving his speech. I want you to comment for me in your ISM, the crowd reaction, the music that was, again, blared and blasted, the imagery and the symbols that you see. That's one thing that the Nazis always tried to do, was to convey a certain image. And they try to convey this image through the use of music, through the use of imagery, through the use of symbols. Skip a line or two. Number two, I want you to describe for me the reaction of the audience, the Nazi leaders. You'll recognize a couple of them because the camera will kind of pan in on them when Hitler begins to speak. Especially notice their eyes. And then finally, I want you to be able to describe for me, not the content, because it's going to be in German, okay, but rather what we're focusing on, the delivery and what makes a demagogue. Again, a very powerful public speaker, but then emphasizes and focuses on those negative thoughts and those negative emotions. That's what he's targeting in his audience, or she for that matter. In this instance, it's a he. So describe his speaking style, his voice inflection. Inflection means the way you're able to raise your voice and bring it down. It's a technique that you learn when you take public speaking classes, especially in college. Body language, hand gestures, and so on. When we study the next of our evil dictators, again, that would be Hitler's role model. His name is Benito Mussolini. You're going to have an opportunity of analyzing his speaking style as well. So I'm not going to share the entire speech with you. It's, again, this video clip is 10 minutes long. I'm only going to play a couple of minutes of it just so you get the gist of being able to focus on and take notes on his style and how this failed artist from Brana, Austria was able to hoodwink and brainwash an entire nation. Here we go.
Der 6. Parteitag der Bewegung geht zu Ende. Was für Millionen Deutsche, die außerhalb unserer Reihen stehen, vielleicht nur als imposantestes Schauspiel politischer Machtentfaltung gewertet wird, war für die Hunderttausende der Kämpfer unendlich mehr. Das große persönliche und geistige Treffen der alten Streiter und Kampfgenossen. Und vielleicht hat mancher unter ihnen, trotz der zwingenden Großartigkeit dieser Herrscher unserer Partei, sich wehmütigen Herzens zurückbesonnen in jene Tage, da es noch schwer war, Nationalsozialist zu sein. Denn als unsere Partei gerade 7 Mann hoch war, sprach sie schon 2 Grundsätze aus. Erstens, sie wollte eine wahrhaftige Weltanschauungspartei sein. Und zweitens, sie wollte daher kompromisslos die einzige Macht und alleinige Macht in Deutschland. Wir mussten als Partei in der Minorität bleiben, weil wir die wertvollsten Elemente des Kampfes und des Opfersinns in der Nation mobilisierten, die zu allen Zeiten nicht die Mehrheit, sondern die Minderheit ausgemacht haben. Und weil dieser beste Rassenwert der deutschen Nation in einer stolzen Selbsteinschätzung, mutig und kühn die Führung des Reiches und Volkes forderte, hat das Volk sich in immer größerer Zahl dieser Führung angeschlossen und unterstellt. Das deutsche Volk ist glücklich in dem Bewusstsein, dass die ewige Flucht der Erscheinungen nunmehr endgültig abgelöst wurde von einem ruhenden Tod. Der sich als Träger seines besten Blutes fühlen und dieses wissend zur Führung der Nation erhoben hat und entschlossen ist, diese Führung zu behalten, wahrzunehmen und nicht mehr abzugeben.
Pretty frightening. You know, you go back 1934, Germany was the most cultured, the most well-educated of any of the European nations. And yet somehow this failed artist from Braunau, Austria, was able to hoodwink and mesmerize and brainwash an entire nation. And the big question again is, how did he pull it off? Couple of observations. Number one, notice when he walked into the arena and everybody was giving the salute, they was so usually synonymous, it's called the Nazi salute. That Heil Hitler salute, that's not original, they borrowed that too. That goes back to the Roman times 2,500 years ago, what Hail Caesar. So they borrowed that. The swastika, we already talked about that, borrowing it from ancient India, both Hinduism and Buddhism. A lot of borrowing and studying of the past, but using it for the wrong reasons. And again, keep in mind, this man was not educated in terms of being taught how to give speeches. That was all his natural ability, which makes this even more frightening. And again, just some of the observation of some of the leaders that were there. Joseph Goebbels, who was the chief propaganda minister. Oh yeah, the Germans studied, the Nazis, I should say, studied propaganda in World War I and realized that the Brits were much better at it. They're going to ramp it up a couple of notches. There was another guy that was in the audience, Heinrich Himmler, who was in charge of the SS. He's going to be the main architect of what becomes known as the Holocaust, the final solution, the genocide of not just German Jews, of all European Jews, the attempt by the Nazis to do so. Let's continue on. What I want everybody to do is I want you to skip a full page. I want you to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. Once again, I would like everybody to date your notes one more time. It is January, again, 12th, 2022. And your topic heading again, Rise of a Madman. All right, let's continue on. So if you would write this down. So again, in the 1920s, as the Nazis are beginning to gain more and more attention and more support, and suddenly people are trying to figure out, who is this Hitler guy? This guy that's giving all these speeches. And every time he gives a speech, the crowds seem to be gathering more and more. More people are joining the fray. And so as a result, people are starting to wonder, who is this guy? They start investigating. And so a question was being raised and whispered. And this question was something that was raised about Hitler throughout his entire rise to power and even as chancellor. And the question is, was Hitler Jewish? So again, going back to 1990, my first year at Aptekissick Junior High, I would have students who would say to me, Mr. Bonk, I was at Hebrew school, and my Hebrew school teacher said that Hitler may have been Jewish. What's the story with that? What's the historical background behind that? So basically, here's what it comes down to. The whole Jewish question of whether Hitler may or may not have been Jewish actually goes back to two really key players, actually three. Number one was his maternal or paternal grandmother, and that's Maria Schicklgruber. That means that she is the mother of, again, Adolf Hitler's father, Alois Hitler. And if you direct your attention up to the overhead screen, this is allegedly a photograph of Maria Schicklgruber. Now you got our second key player, and of course that's Alois Schicklgruber. And we've already talked about Alois Schicklgruber, now Hitler, who again, until he was 39 years old, was known as Alois Schicklgruber. And it wasn't until at almost the age of 40, he took on the name Hitler. And then the third key player was a gentleman by the name of Leopold Frankenberger. So the story is that, again, Maria Schicklgruber in 1837 found out that she was pregnant with child, and that child would become Alois Hitler, the eventual father of Adolf Hitler in 1889. Now, when she gave birth to her son, she wasn't married. She was an unwed mother, and so he was an illegitimate child. Legally, under the eyes of the law, there was no discernible father. So there were questions, who exactly was the biological father? So there were whispers that since, again, Maria allegedly worked for this gentleman right here, Leopold Frankenberger, he may have been the father. But again, there is no evidence. There is no DNA testing to confirm that or deny it, for that matter. Just as pure speculation, gossip. And so the question about whether or not Hitler was Jewish, if indeed Leopold was his grandfather, which has never been confirmed, Leopold was Jewish. He was an Austrian Jew. So if that's the case, Adolf Hitler would have been 1/4 Jewish. But again, as I say to my students, and I go back to 1990, 32 years ago, this is just pure conjecture. This is nothing but against speculation because nobody really knows who exactly was the biological father of this guy. So until we have some concrete evidence, it's just that. It's just simply a story that has never truly been confirmed. But on the other hand, the Soviet Union had investigated Hitler and his background. The Americans investigated Hitler and his background, tried to figure out who this guy was and where he came from. As a matter of fact, in 1945, again, American fighter pilots were dropping leaflets over Berlin and saying Heil Schickeruber, basically mocking Hitler, saying, we know who you are. The Soviets were convinced that Hitler had Jewish lineage. But again, it's pure speculation. That's all it turned out to be. One of the interesting stories I had read and researched many, many years ago, that one of the first things Hitler did when he rose to power in Germany was he basically destroyed his hometown, had it burned to the ground. And there were a lot of questions. Why did he do it? Was he trying to cover something up? And again, nobody really knows the answer to it except for him, and that being Hitler. And again, I dovetail back to the Jewish question. Until we have, again, irrefutable DNA evidence, it's just purely speculation. Let's continue on. All right, but we do know this did happen. So on November 8th, 1923, Adolf Hitler, again, now the quasi-leader of the Nazi Party, are going to start what's called the Beer Hall Putsch. And you definitely want to circle this and put a big asterisk by, because this is a significant event in Hitler's rise to power. So the word Putsch is German. It's basically a revolt, a revolution. So what Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party was trying to do was they were attempting to overthrow the legal government of Germany in 1923, and that was the Weimar Republic. Remember, it was installed in 1919 after the Kaiser was deposed, and this was Germany's first foray into democracy. These were the ringleaders of the Beer Hall Putsch, and right there, now you notice the mustache is much more recognizable. That is Adolf Hitler. So what was the outcome? Well, the outcome, we're going to get to that in a second. We're going to come back to those notes in a moment. I'd like everybody to skip a full page. I'd like you to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. We're going to watch multiple video clips today. Make certain, again, you date your notes for today. It's January 12th, 2022. And once again, on the top line, I need a topic heading. You're going to write down guy questions, Beer Hall Putsch. So this video clip, what it's going to do, is going to provide you guys some nice background information and tying together. This is one of the significant moments in Hitler's rise to power. All right, let me give you some guy questions. I'm going to go through this quickly. So you're going to need to pause the Zoomcast to give you guys yourself a chance to catch up. And that's the beauty of these Zoomcasts. You can. Number one. So I want you to explain for me how the Treaty of Versailles greatly angered Adolf Hitler. This is, again, really the seeds are being planted when World War I had ended in Hitler's rise to power. Skip a line or two. Number two, what were the three early goals of Hitler and the Nazi Party? Number three, what happened on November 8th, 1923? And who are the stormtroopers? Number four, what happened on November 9th, the next day, 1923? And this date in particular is very curious because in 1938, 15 years into the future, this marks the beginning of what's called Kristallnacht, which I will talk about later on, the night of broken glass. One thing with Hitler is, again, he's big on symbolism, he's big on dates, he's big on history, but I keep saying it again and again, he's using history for the wrong reasons, not for the right ones. And then finally, so what eventually happened to Hitler as a result of the Beer Hall Putsch? The attempt by Hitler and the Nazi Party to try to overthrow the rightful legal government of Germany at this point, the Weimar Republic, a democracy based very similar to what we have here in the United States of America. All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we go. The Beer Hall Putsch of 1923.
The date, the 8th of November, 1923. On this day, Adolf Hitler attempted to overthrow the German government. Adolf Hitler, the leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, or Nazi Party, had quickly risen through the German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party's predecessor, after initially infiltrating it for German army intelligence. Many, including Hitler, had been appalled by Germany's surrender at the end of the First World War, and deeply resented the conditions imposed on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles, which demanded costly reparations and territorial concessions. He agreed with much of the sentiment of the German Workers' Party, and after assuming leadership of it, Hitler became known as a gifted and passionate orator who would speak to thousands about fighting Marxism and overturning the Treaty of Versailles and curtailing the rights of Jews. However, many of the party's leadership considered him too overbearing and attempted to oust Hitler in June 1921 by merging with the German Socialist Party. Hitler was, however, formally elected party chairman on the 28th of July, 1921, with 533 votes to 1, replacing the party's founder, Anton Drexler. Inspired by Italian fascist Benito Mussolini's successful march on Rome at the end of October 1922, and put under pressure by his scheduled mass meetings to begin at the end of September being banned, Hitler sought to march on Munich, the capital of the Bavarian state. The state had been put under the near-autonomous and total control of Gustav von Kahr on the 26th of September, 1923, following a period of growing turbulence that saw widespread rioting, political violence, and drops in the standard of living. On the evening of the 8th of November, during the height of crippling inflation and further national turmoil, Hitler and other prominent NSDAP figures, along with 600 of the party's supporters, formed into a paramilitary group called the SA, or Stormtroopers, marched on the Bürgerbraukeller, an enormous beer hall where Kahr was making a speech in front of 3,000 people. Kahr was forced from the auditorium at gunpoint, and Hitler gave a short speech in which he won the support of the crowd, and forced Kahr and the other two members of Bavaria's Triumvirate, Police Head Colonel Hans Ritter von Seisser and the Reichswehr General Otto von Lossow, to offer their support. Lossow, Seisser, and Kahr were then allowed to go free, enabling them to warn others of Hitler's attempted putsch and organize an opposition. The only member of the Bavarian cabinet not at the Bürgerbraukeller, Franz Matt, learned of the putsch when having dinner with the man who would later become Pope Pius XII. Matt immediately began to round up the support of the army and police. On the 9th of November, losing momentum, Hitler began to march with around 2,000 men on the Bavarian Defense Ministry, but was stopped by around 130 police officers. The two groups briefly exchanged gunfire, and 16 marchers were killed, as were 4 police officers, effectively ending the putsch. Hitler was jailed for 5 years for treason, but served only 9 months, in which time he wrote Mein Kampf. Less than 10 years later, on the 30th of January, 1933, he would, at least somewhat legitimately, become Chancellor of Germany, before dissolving German democracy and going on to initiate the Second World War and the Holocaust. Kahr was killed during the Night of the Long Knives on the 30th of June, 1934, after being abducted and taken to Dachau concentration camp. Everything becomes history. Until next time, goodbye.
So again, just a couple of quick observations. Number one, so again, Hitler's a borrower. Everything he did, there was nothing original about him. He borrowed from people. He borrowed from places. He borrowed from cultures. Again, his rise to power. He very much studied the rise to power in Italy of a guy by the name of Benito Mussolini. We'll be studying Mussolini very soon once we get through Hitler's rise to power. And again, number two, Hitler again goes from 1923, 1924, being again incarcerated, putting in jail, and literally 10 years later, goes from being in jail to becoming the undisputed leader of Germany. Now we would call it Nazi Germany. What a frightening thought. Go back to the previous page. Let's continue the story. All right. So to summarize the Beer Hall Putsch, 1923, quickly put down by the Bavarian police. Hitler is arrested. He's put on trial along with other of the ringleaders, I should say, of the Nazi Party, and was convicted of treason. And by the way, treason, It's the worst crime against a government. It's trying to overthrow government. As a matter of fact, do you know there's only one crime listed in the United States Constitution that's punishable by death? And that's treason, not murder, treason. That's how serious of this is. So think about this for a moment. Hitler was found guilty of treason, trying to overthrow the Weimar Republic. So they could have executed him as a result of this. So instead, what happens is Hitler's given a 5-year jail sentence. And as they mentioned in the video clip, he was let out much earlier due to, ironically, good behavior. And there's nothing, that's kind of an irony, not kind of, it is an irony when you study Hitler, because there's nothing good about his behavior. Now, as I stated, he gets out in less than a little less than a year. And it's one of those classic what ifs in history. What if Hitler had been executed for, again, committing treason against the German government, the rightful legal government, the Weimar Republic? And the answer is, if he had been executed, the Nazi Party would have simply dissipated because they had lost its spokesperson. Hitler doesn't rise to power because he's gone. And as a result, there is no World War II. There is no Holocaust and final solution. But that's not the way the story plays out, or that's not the way the story is told. So, yes, he gets out on, ironically, good behavior, which, again, they showed mercy to a guy that never showed mercy to anybody else. But here's the other key component when you study Hitler's rise to power. So the Beer Hall Putsch fails. He ends up going to prison, was given a 5-year jail sentence, serves less than a year. And it's during this time he would sit there and he would ramble on and on his thoughts about the world around him and what was going on in Germany. And his cellmate took copious notes and wrote down what he had been rambling about. And he told Hitler, you should consider writing a book. And that's exactly what Hitler's going to do. So when he gets out of prison, Hitler's going to write an extremely controversial book that ties into our story on Hitler's rise to power. And this book is called Mein Kampf. And if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, this is one of the book covers, Adolf Hitler author, Mein Kampf. So a little more background information. So if you would write this down. So this book, when you talk about a warning sign, a red flag about Adolf Hitler, here is one of your biggest red flags. You can go back to his contentious relationship with his father. You can go back to, again, the tragic death of his mother. You can go back to him being rejected from the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. You can go back to his participation in World War I. All of these are huge factors in the molding and shaping of Adolf Hitler becoming Adolf Hitler. And here's another huge red flag. So Mein Kampf in English means my struggle. So in order to really understand the essence of Hitler, you got to read Mein Kampf. I've read not the whole book, I've read parts of it, and it's disturbing because basically this is his blueprint for what he envisions is going to happen if indeed he rises to power in Germany. So for example, number one of the huge themes of Mein Kampf is he talks about nationalism. He talks about restoring German pride in their country. But again, we talked about nationalism before when we did World War I. There's that good side and dark side. What Hitler's focusing on is the dark side of nationalism. He's talking about blind trust. He is talking about asking the German people to figuratively become zombies and just blindly follow him, no matter what he says or no matter what horrible things he does. That's not the kind of nationalism you want to play with. Number two, another huge theme, besides talking about restoring pride in the German people, is a lot of talk about racism. And when you talk about racism with Hitler and the Nazis, it's about racial superiority. He talked a lot in terms of Mein Kampf about the superiority of the Aryan race, the Germanic people, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed people. And he talked about how they were the masters. They were the superior people of Europe, and they should impose their will on everybody else. And then one of the great ironies of this is when you look at Hitler, he doesn't look Nordic to me. He doesn't look Germanic. He doesn't have blonde hair and blue eyes, but that's exactly what he was talking about. Number three, not only did he talk about the racial superiority of the German people and how everybody else was lower than them, he talked a lot in Mein Kampf about revenge. Remember, targeting into those deep, dark, negative emotions, going back to him being a demagogue. That's what public speakers who are demagogues do. They tap into the darkest recesses of your brain, not so much your brain, I would say more your heart and what you're feeling, not what you're thinking. And in particular, when he talks about revenge in Mein Kampf, he talks about how angry, and the video clip alluded to this, about how he was angry about the Treaty of Versailles, angry about how the Brits and the French, he perceived them excessively punishing Germany with the war guilt clause, the $33 billion in reparations that Germany had to pay to Great Britain and France, and the admission of guilt and assuming responsibility for all the horrible atrocities that World War I generated. But the other big, huge theme of Adolf Hitler, and this goes back to, again, when he was living in Vienna, Austria between 1909 and 1914, and this is where we think he was exposed to anti-Semitism through Karl Lueger, again, the former mayor of Vienna, a blatant demagogue and an anti-Semite, and of course, again, the guy that started the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther, who wrote that very now infamous book on the Jews and their lies. And this is where Hitler starts, again, in Mein Kampf, starts scapegoating and starts blaming, in his mind, German Jews for Germany losing the war. Even though German Jews had nothing to do with Germany losing the war. I told you, German Jews fought for the fatherland. They fought and participated in World War I for the Central Powers. They fought for Germany because they considered themselves to be loyal German citizens. They just practiced a different religion, pure and simple. But again, I want to emphasize, when you talk about anti-Semitism, and I would draw a line off to the side, he didn't invent anti-Semitism in Germany. He tapped into it. Just like everything he did in his rise to power, he was a borrower. He used things, and he used them for the wrong reasons. So if you will write this down, 1924, Hitler finally gets out of prison for, again, good behavior. One of the great ironies when you study Hitler's rise to power, because he would never show mercy to any of his enemies. So there's an irony when he gets out of prison in 1924. And the irony is the economic depression that Germany had been dealing with basically since 1920, 1921 was starting to actually get better. The reparations were easing up. The German economy was starting to improve. Jobs were starting to come back again. So now what's starting to happen is when he gets out of prison, he's trying to stir everybody up. People are not listening to him the way they were before, because that was one of the things that Hitler, the Nazis, targeted, were those dark negative emotions. But if you're working and things are better, it's harder for the Nazis to gain that audience. They're losing their audience. As a matter of fact, even as I mentioned earlier, the reparations with Great Britain and France were easing up. So Germany was not paying that kind of money that they were previously. And remember the Dawes Plan, where the United States was lending Germany money. That was one of the reasons why the reparations were easing up. So the Germans can now, or the German government, the Weimar Republic, could now take some of their money and now focus their capital on rebuilding the German economy. So things were getting better. So the end result is, as I stated just a few moments ago, Hitler and the Nazis by 1924, 1925, 1926, 1927, you notice their popularity in Germany is slowly beginning to decline. It's going on a descent, like an airplane beginning to land. So the way things are going, the current trajectory is the Nazis would have been eventually just disappeared as just simply a footnote in history. But that's not the way, of course, we know the story played out. So if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, that, of course, is, remember I taught you about silent film star Charlie Chaplin? That was in one of our assignments when we studied the great, the Roaring '20s. And Charlie Chaplin, at one point, one of his roles in Hollywood was he portrayed Adolf Hitler. But by 1929, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party's fortunes changed for the better. Horrible for us, horrible for the world. But what happens is, just when everybody kind of sensed that the Nazis were just going to eventually disappear as an afterthought, as a footnote in history, and then suddenly something happens that changes Hitler's fortunes and changes the fortunes of the Nazi Party. And what changes their fortunes is something called Black Tuesday. What changes everything is the stock market crash in America. So remember we talked about Black Thursday and then Black Tuesday several days later, over 16 million shares or stocks were bought or were sold, I should say, for literally pennies. And remember, as a result of the Great Depression and as a result of the stock market crash, we, the United States, entered into our Great Depression. Well, guess what? Somebody else does too. And I would draw a line off to the side, and that somebody is Germany. So Germany now is going to go into their second Great Depression. So once again, jobs are being lost. People are angry, they're scared, they're frustrated, they're humiliated. So all those deep, dark, negative emotions are coming back again. And these are the same dark emotions that the Nazis and especially Hitler will attempt to capitalize on. So this raises a question. Who could be indirectly, not directly, but who could be indirectly blamed for Hitler's rise to power? And the answer is real simple. I'm going to point one finger at a guy by the name of Calvin Coolidge. Because if you remember the story that Calvin Coolidge was warned about 1926, 1927, that too many Americans were engaging in speculation, risky business practices to make money, and that he was encouraged by the Treasury Department to really curtail speculation. And he did nothing because remember, he received a barrel of apples from a friend of his from Vermont and thought that was more important than stopping speculation. So no, I'm not directly blaming Calvin Coolidge for Hitler's rise to power, but maybe if America didn't go into a Great Depression, maybe Germany would not have entered into its second depression, and maybe Hitler and the Nazis would have just simply, again, disappeared as a footnote in history. But as we know, that's not the way the story plays out. Let's continue on. Count those apples. So as a result of America's Great Depression, so here's your connection again. When you wonder why you have to study the past and why do we need to study the stock market crash? Because not only did it impact the United States, and it's again eventually dealing with the worst economic crisis in our history, the Great Depression, but now it's going to impact Germany's economy as well. And just like in America, every couple of years, Germany has elections. And watch what the Nazis slowly do. And they're going to start to take advantage of the current political and especially the economic atmosphere of the country. So 1928, big election in Germany. 800,000 people vote for Nazi candidates in what's called the Reichstag. The Reichstag is basically, and I would draw a line off to the side, this should be a good oral note for you, it's the lawmaking body of Germany. It is the Reichstag is to Germany what Congress is to the United States of America. And as a result, the Nazis are going to gain 12 seats in the Reichstag. And if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, that's a modern photograph of the Reichstag, the German lawmaking body. Now look what happens 2 years later, 1928. Remember, we're still not in the Great Depression at this point. But by 1930, we're officially in the Great Depression. And notice how the number of votes, popular votes, has gone up exponentially. So now Nazi candidates have gone from 800,000 votes to over 6,500,000 votes. And now, instead of controlling 12 seats in the Reichstag, the lawmaking body, they control 107 seats in the Reichstag. 1932, the same year that Adolf Hitler's arch nemesis, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, overwhelmingly is elected our 32nd president of the United States. Notice what happens again. Nazi candidates running for the Reichstag, again, almost double, from 6.5 million votes to 12 million votes. And now the Nazis have a huge advantage in the Reichstag. They control 230 seats in the Reichstag. So what the Nazis have very insidiously done is through legal means and taking advantage of the current economic and political climate of Germany, they're slowly seizing control over Germany itself. 5-6 years earlier, the Nazis were basically disappearing. And now they are going to very quickly be calling the shots. Horrible for the world. So to give you an idea of how things are looking, so at this point, there were 608 total seats in the Reichstag. You needed 305 seats to have a majority. So the Nazis don't have a majority yet. They're at 230, so they're still a little bit behind. But the point I would make, and I would draw a line off to the side, they may not have a majority of the seats in the Reichstag, but they have a much louder voice. And that's what makes them more frightening now at this point. Because now when they talk, people are really starting to listen. So ladies and gentlemen, if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, by 1932, these banners, these flags are going to be waving a lot more prominently throughout not just the Reichstag, but throughout Germany as well. So in 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed chancellor. So he's going to become the number 2 guy in Germany. And think about this, 10 years earlier, just 10 years earlier in 1923, he started the failed attempt to overthrow the Weimar Republic, the Beer Hall Putsch. He was arrested and put in jail. And 10 years later, he's now the number 2 guy of the entire country. Remember, he's a foreigner. He's not from Germany. He's from Austria. Now, when he was appointed chancellor in 1933, this was important for a couple of reasons. So number one, if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, so this is Hitler, 1933, the Chancellor of Germany, and this was the president at the time, and that was Paul von Hindenburg. I've mentioned Paul von Hindenburg before because Paul von Hindenburg was a former famous German general during World War I. First in the Eastern Front, fighting against Russia, again, the Battle of Tannenberg Forest, and then later on was shifted to the Western Front. So Paul von Hindenburg and leaders within Germany thought that by appointing Hitler chancellor, they would be able to better control him. Now, what's, again, a really fascinating part of the story is that at the time when von Hindenburg was thinking about appointing Hitler chancellor of Germany, the number 2 guy after him, on January 30th, 1933, Erich Ludendorff, Paul von Hindenburg's, again, good friend from World War I, had written Paul von Hindenburg a now famous letter. And the letter was a dire warning. So if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, this, of course, is a better photograph. That's Paul von Hindenburg during World War I in 1914, 1915. So I just want to share with you just a small excerpt of the letter itself. So this was, again, Erich Ludendorff's warning to Paul von Hindenburg. And this has been translated to English. Quote, by appointing Hitler Chancellor of the Reich is empire, the Third Reich. Germany has had 3 Reichs, 3 empires in history, which I'll talk about later on. By appointing Hitler Chancellor of the Reich, you have handed over our sacred German fatherland to one of the greatest demagogues of all time. We talked about demagogue before. I prophesy to you, I predict to you, this evil man, referencing Hitler, will plunge our Reich into the abyss and inflict immeasurable woe to our nation. Future generations will curse you in your grave for this action. So basically what had happened was, again, this is Paul von Hindenburg right here during World War I, and that's Erich Ludendorff right there. Erich Ludendorff had joined the Nazi Party in the 1920s, knew Hitler pretty well, but he eventually left the Nazi Party because he didn't like the direction the Nazis were going, and in particular, he didn't like Hitler at all. And that's why he warned his old friend Paul von Hindenburg, don't underestimate this guy. Don't underestimate this party, this group of individuals. I was with them. I know what they're like. And if you appoint him chancellor, you will bring great shame and sorrow to the fatherland, to Deutschland, to Germany. And that's exactly the way the story ended up playing out. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think at this point, we're going to stop my Zoomcast here. So what I'd like everybody to now do is I would like everybody to take out your correctable tape, and I would like for you to go, and I'd like for you to clean up everything that you cross out or trace over in your ISN. Remember, your ISN is a portfolio of your absolute best effort. Then you're going to take out your multiple colored highlighters, tip of the tip, and I want you to focus on those words you can visualize in your mind, those persons, places, and of course, things. Remember, don't highlight everything. In addition, I want you to also please go take 10 to 15 minutes, go through your ISN, review the information you're practicing. You practice for soccer, you practice for basketball, there's no difference. School's no different. You got to practice for school also. And again, take the opportunity of handing your ISN to somebody at home, your mom, your dad. Maybe again, do a Zoom session or a FaceTime, and you teach this information to them. You channel your inner Mr. Bonk and tell them the story. Tell them about the Beer Hall Putsch and how Adolf Hitler had attempted to overthrow the Weimar Republic and how he was arrested and put in jail and how he eventually gets out for good behavior. One of the great ironies in one of the great ironic individuals of history. And how when he was in prison, he wrote Mein Kampf, which is a huge red flag. When you read Mein Kampf, there are some really disturbing themes and ideas that Hitler disseminated. So if you read the book, you would say, whoa, we got some red flags here. And how when he gets out of prison, how the Nazi party was starting to lose, again, influence because things in Germany were better, economically speaking. And then what happens? You have the Great Depression in America. We have a saying, when America sneezes, the world catches cold. Well, Germany got a really bad cold. And it now gives Hitler and the Nazi party more, again, opportunity to tap into those dark emotions of the German people. And again, by 1933, Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Nazi Germany. In 1934, August 2nd, Paul von Hindenburg dies of old age. And Hitler now becomes not president, he becomes the dictator of Nazi Germany. And 5 years later, plunges Europe and the world into World War II. So again, I hope you enjoyed today's Zoomcast as much as I enjoyed creating it and sharing it with you. Of course, next time I will share a video clip that does a nice job of tying together Hitler's rise to power. And then I'm going to talk about some of the things Hitler did between the time of 1934, when Hitler became Führer or complete dictator or leader of Germany, until 1939, when he plunged the world into World War II. So as I always like to say, as I wrap up one of my Zoomcasts, you know, the story may have ended today, but you better believe the saga is going to continue tomorrow. And the rest is what we say everyone is history. Peace out, everybody. Thank you so much. And as always, please be well.